Hi, welcome back for another lecture in philosophy. In this video, I will cover the philosophy of mind and specifically the mind-body problem. What is that we call the mind? This is one of the most interesting questions, at least if you ask me. What exactly is the mind? What exactly are thoughts? How are thoughts able to make you do things? For example, you're thinking, I'm thirsty. How is this thought about being thirsty modifying your behavior in such a way that you get up, get a bottle of water, and drink? I mean, after all, they are non-physical things, thoughts. They're not made of matter. They're not made of energy or anything. So how can they modify matter? How can the brain, furthermore, be responsible for thinking? When you look at a brain, it's pretty disgusting. It's a squishy tissue, oatmeal-like organ. You want to tell me that that disgusting thing gives rise to all this? That's mysterious. So these questions are, as we will see, these are some of the questions. Questions that have to do with what we call the mind-body problem. Why is it a problem? Well, I already anticipated why it seems to be a problem. But essentially, it is a problem because since the dawn of philosophy and science, people are still wondering what the relationship between the mind and the body is, or whether the mind and the body is the same thing. We're speaking of the same entity. As we will see, some people people are divided. Scientists and philosophers are divided on this. There's some who believe that it is the same thing that we're speaking about. We're speaking one entity, the brain, and the brain is the mind, exactly the mind. On the other hand, there's another group of people who say that's not a satisfactory answer because it is plain and obvious that the mind is not the same thing as the brain, because when I describe mental things, I'm not describing parts of the brain, for example. So the existence of consciousness itself is the biggest mystery, one of the biggest mysteries in the world and of the world. Let me talk about the mind-body problem in more detail. Philosophers typically divide the mind-body problem into four distinct strands or points, whatever you want to call them. Point one, there is consciousness. Point two is what is known as intentionality. Point three is subjectivity. And point four is causation or mental causation. Let me speak briefly about each one. Consciousness is perhaps the most mysterious of all. I mean, you have to ask yourself, you are conscious, you've been conscious for most of your life, but why? Well, most people would probably answer, because I have a brain. But how is having a brain magically give you consciousness? Could you, for example, imagine a human, not a human being, a being that is very similar to human beings, that has a body, that has a brain, and is not conscious? why is it that the brain has this special power of consciousness? I mean, after all, it's just another organ. Why isn't the liver responsible for consciousness? Why is it consciousness rooted in the physical brain, in that squishy tissue and blood and disgusting brain? It's very mysterious. Now, of course, you can be happy and say, well, there's no mystery to me. The brain does it all. How? How is it possible that an organ made of flesh and blood does everything else? Well, because it has neurons. How is having neurons make you conscious? See where this is going? So consciousness is just the biggest mystery of all. Why is it that individuals with brains must be conscious? Is it possible, for example, to imagine, I mean, it's possible to imagine, but it's possible that there exist beings that we don't know who don't have a brain and they are conscious? I don't know. Well, the second problem that constitutes the mind-body problem is what is known as intentionality. Now, intentionality, don't get confused or tricked by the name of the term intentionality. It's not about your intentions, okay? What intentionality means is that your thoughts have a content, okay? For example, you're thinking about this lecture, or you're thinking about your car, you're thinking about your vacation. You're thinking about many things. You have thoughts, desires, many mental states. These mental states come with a content, okay? Also, you believe that some things are true, some things are false. For example, it's false that the moon is made of cheese, okay? But the problem of intentionality is, it says, how is it possible that thoughts, mental states, desires, beliefs have a content? How can thoughts be true or false? How can thoughts be about? Sometimes philosophers use this word, that mental states have an aboutness. They are about other objects external to yourself. How is it possible that your thoughts, which are immaterial, have a relationship to material things? How is it possible that they are about other things? How is it possible that they are true or false? Thoughts are immaterial as far as we know. How can they have this aboutness property to them? It's very mysterious. The third problem is the problem of subjectivity. Now, simply the problem of subjectivity is that the idea that we all have a mental life, and that mental life is private. No one can feel or know or have a perspective of the world the same way that I do. Okay? There's no way, even for the most sophisticated, by far, by the most sophisticated machine to actually experience what I experience. Have you ever had a banana before? Of course, right? And you know what it tastes like. But you don't know what it tastes like to me. Or if I see the color red, you say, I've seen the color red before. I know what it feels like to see red. But you're not inside my brain. You don't know what it feels like to me. As a matter of fact, you don't even know what color I really see. When I see a patch of red, I mean, you see a patch of color, and you color red. I also color red, but you see red, I see green. There's no way for you to know. There's no way for anyone to know. So there's certain sense in which our mental experience, our mental life is subjective. We cannot get out of subjectivity. That's a big problem. What is mine, and you can't feel or conceive what I see and feel. The fourth problem is mental causation. This is very simple. This is very Science 101. If I want to move this bottle of water, I must have a material thing because there is an exchange of energy. You all know that. There is an exchange of momentum. There is an exchange of energy, of mass. You can't just take a bottle of water and move it with your thoughts. I know that there are people who believe that, but it's not really possible. Because scientifically we understand that there must be an exchange of energy between objects in order to interact one with the other. So when it comes to the mind and the mental world, how is it possible, the question goes, that these thoughts of mine, my desires, my feelings, which are not made of mass, they don't have a mass, made of mass. They don't have a mass. They're not made of matter. They're not made of atoms, of strings, or anything. They are abstract things that we call thoughts. How is it possible that these abstract things that don't have a mass are able to interact with the physical world, namely with your body? So, for example, if you have a feeling of hunger, how is that feeling modifying your behavior? If you think that I'm a liar, okay, and you avoid listening to me, or you disbelieve it, how is that thought making you disbelieve me? It's quite mysterious. So these four problems, consciousness, intentionality, subjectivity, and mental causation, constitute what is called the mind-body problem. Okay? So the mind-body problem, again, is how do we explain the mental and the physical? How do they relate? How do they come into contact one with the other? Okay? So the mind-body problem has puzzled scientists and philosophers and everybody for millennia, for centuries. Now, in the rest of the lecture, I'm going to explain to you how the mind-body problem has been addressed by different people. Typically, it's been addressed in two different ways, and these are the following ways. The first one is materialism. The second one is dualism. Okay? So, in other words, we have a problem. What is the relationship between the mind and the body? There are two different responses. One is materialism, one is dualism. Let me talk about each one. Materialism, also sometimes known as physicalism, is the notion that says that this division, this dichotomy, the mind and the body, is a false dichotomy. There aren't two things, the mind and the body, but rather one. There's only the brain, and the brain is the same thing as the mind. While we'll see later different theories have different ideas of explaining why there's only one thing. But the point of materialism is that there is one thing only, and that is the physical matter, the physical brain. On the other hand, dualism is the theory that says that admits that there are two things. There is a physical body and a non-physical entity. In fact, many dualists believe that there are two realms in the world. There's a physical and a non-physical realm. And that's where the mind is, in the non-physical realm. That's how we explain away the mind-body problem. Now, let's see who's successful and who's not. Let's look at some theories. Let's look at dualist theories of the mind first. One of the oldest theories of the mind, dualistic theories of the mind, is what is known as substance dualism. In other words, substance dualism says that the mind is a substance, a mental substance. It's not made of matter, it's not made of anything, it's made of something else, who knows what, but it's not physical. It doesn't occupy space, it doesn't exist in space. That would explain why thoughts exist, because they don't exist in space, but they do exist. They exist in a different realm, in a non-physical realm. So the brain is physical, the mind is non-physical. They're both substances. That's why it's called substance dualism. One is a substance, physical substance, the other a non-physical substance. Property dualism is another kind of dualism. Now think about the difference between property and substance. Okay, a substance is, well, plastic, for example, is a substance. Now, this adapter is made of plastic. It is a substance, plastic, and it has many characteristics. One of which is hardness. Okay, so hardness is a property, but hardness is not a property intrinsic to my phone adapter, because it is a property that is shared by many different substances. So you see, a substance is unique, is not shared. Plastic, metal, glass, and so on. Dish soap, okay? Those are substances. Substances do not occur everywhere. I mean, in the sense that they don't share their essence. On the other hand, properties like hardness, smoothness, these are properties. And property dualism says that the mind is a separate thing from the body. So, again, using this example, hardness is attached to this adapter. You can't take it away. But when I feel the hardness, okay, the hardness itself as a property, the property of hardness is not the phone charger, because, as I said, I can find it on the table. Okay? Similarly, property dualists would argue that the mind, what we call mind, thoughts, desires, feelings, and so on, they are properties of the brain, but they might be physical or non-physical properties of the brain. Most property dualists say they're non-physical. Okay. The two main kinds of property dualism are epiphenomenalism and interactionism. There are a lot of isms. I'm sorry about all the terminology. You don't have to memorize all the terminology. It's just to give you an idea of various theories. Both theories argue that the mind as a property emerges, so they say it's emergent, emerges out of mental, it emerges out of the brain complexity, physical complexity. So when the brain, or the physical brain, is, well, sophisticated enough, it has a certain number of neurons, this property emerges, this property being the mind, emerges, appears all of a sudden. But the important thing to understand is that mental states, the mental life, is not reducible to the physical. Okay, they are two separate things. That's why it's dualism. Now, Epiphenomenalism, believe it or not, used to be a theory to which many philosophers adhered. And Epiphenomenalism, I have to say, it's quite bizarre. It would be very strange if it were true, because Epiphenomenalism says that the mental phenomena, so to speak, ride on top of brain processes. So on the one hand, there's your brain here, and all its processes, physical processes, firing the neurons and so on. And on top of this, but separate, above, there is your mental contents, your thoughts, your desires, and so on. Some people use the analogy of an old train, a choo-choo train that produces smoke. Okay, so the smoke of the train would be the mental content, the mental life, the mind. But the mind rides on top and doesn't really have an interaction with the physical. But then how do they happen to work together? Because if I think of something, then my physical body reacts. So how do they communicate? Well, there are various theories, some bizarre, some less bizarre, but some theories say, for example, that God makes sure that your thoughts and your brain go hand in hand. Well, we don't have to get into that, but the point is that mental states have no causal powers upon your physical body. Okay, so for obvious reason, you can see that this theory was abandoned pretty soon, and interactionism as a theory was proposed. The idea that, well, then again, that the mind does interact with your brain, but how they interact is not completely clear. Now, what motivates dualism? Why being a dualist? So far, you might think, if you think that these theories are bizarre, you might wonder, why be a dualist in the first place? Well, let's look why. Let's look at some reasons. One of the main reasons is religion. Religious people believe in God, in a God. There are different religions. There are people who believe in many gods, for example, the Hindus. But the point is still the same. God is, for religious people, God exists. Now, God is not a physical entity. God is a mind, Okay? So, if God exists and God is a mind, what follows from this is that it is possible that mind exists without the body. Okay? Now, you think about if this argument is good or bad, and that's totally up to you. Think about it. Well, for one thing, the very argument relies on the notion of the existence of God, which is highly disputed by many people, that God doesn't exist. But I let you decide this is a good argument, a good reason for being a dualist. Obviously, if you're religious, you might be inclined to be a dualist. Another argument is the argument from introspection. This is simply says, when I introspect, I don't see physical processes happening in my brain. I only feel desires, beliefs, sensations, thoughts, and so on. There's nothing of that neurochemical processing going on. Okay? So it follows that the mind cannot be a neurochemical process. It must be more than that. Another argument, a better argument, I think, is the argument from irreducibility. This argument says, if there are mental phenomena for which no physical explanation could be given, then we must conclude that the physical is not all there is. Now, for example, how can you explain language? How can you explain mathematical reasoning? These are not things that can be explained in physical terms. Okay? Language itself is not a physical phenomenon. I mean, it's physical in the sense that you have vocal cords, you speak, but language itself, the capacity to think mathematically, to do in mathematical computation, that is not something that a physical object can do. Therefore, the very notion that we have mental capacities such as mathematical capacities, communication, language, and so on, they show that the mind is not physical. It's non-physical. If these are good or bad arguments, well, you let me know in the comments, okay? In the comments, not here, in the comments in the blackboard. Another argument is, even better argument, is the argument from personal identity. This is a very fascinating argument, okay? Think about this. You change throughout your life, and possibly every single part of your body, every single cell that you have now in your body, that constitutes your body, is completely different. It's new. You didn't have these parts, your hair, your cells, everything has changed. Okay? Since you were, for example, 3 years old. Now, if everything changes, the brain changes, the cells change, the neurons change, then what makes you you? Right? So the argument from personal identity says the physical, how do you explain that the physical body changes, but the identity, yourself? Now, I'm not speaking about your taste, for example. Your tastes change, but whose tastes change? Yours. So if I say your tastes have changed, I imply that there is a self that never changed. But then, if the self is rooted in your body, in your physical body, then that would be different too. It would change too. Consequently, since you have the same, you are the same self, the same person throughout your lifetime, This implies that the self, you, is not rooted in your physical body, but rather in your mental, okay, in your non-physical, in a non-physical realm, and in your mind, which is non-physical. Let's look at some arguments against dualism. Well, one argument is the argument from simplicity. Typically in science, scientists favor those arguments that are simple. The simpler, the better. Okay? Simpler theories are better than complex theories. Materialism is the simplest theories between the two, because it only says there is matter. We all know that. That's all that exists. Dualists have these complicated theories that there is something beyond matter and interacts with the matter. Dualism must be false. Another argument is the explanatory power of materialism. Materialism says neuroscientists can explain a great deal about your behavior. They can monitor your brain with scans, with all kinds of computers, and monitor the whereabouts of your activities. Okay, and they can actually map. They have mapped your brain. They know that a certain part of the brain, a certain group of neurons, is responsible for a certain activity. So the dualist can't explain squat, the materialist says, because all they say is that the mind is mental stuff, or it's a property, it's separate from the brain, can't explain anything. Materialists can explain a lot, so dualism must be false. The argument from neural dependence is a very good argument. Think about it. People who receive, say, a severe hit on their heads, what happens is that as a result, they change personality. And if the brain is damaged, your personality, person's personality, and motor skills and everything changes. So now, how is it possible that the mind is non-physical when, if you modify the brain or damage the brain, the physical body reacts and changes? That seems that to be evidence that it is the brain, the source of the mental life. Finally, well, maybe not finally, the argument from evolutionary history. Well, this essentially relies on the idea of evolution. Evolution says that we evolved. We are not born with brains, okay? Our ancestors didn't have a brain. I mean, I'm sorry, they had a brain. They didn't have a mind, sophisticated mind, like we do. So the idea is that everything evolves, okay? And so the mind, it's something that arises out of complexity. Okay? It emerges through evolution. Okay? So what does this mean? It means that it is only one thing that exists, the physical body, physical matter, that evolves and produces what we call the mind. Now let's look at materialists. Now we looked at dualist theories. Now let's see what materialists have to offer in terms of theories. Let's see if they are any better than dualists. So the first one is behaviorism. This is an ancient theory, behaviorism. I would say that no one actually argues for behaviorism anymore. Behaviorism is the idea that the mind doesn't exist. Now, if you ask a behaviorist, but wait a minute, how do you explain language? How do you explain thinking? How do you explain feeling, desiring? There are no such things as feeling, desires, and so on, the behaviorist would say. All there is behavior. Through and through, just behavior. Okay? Nothing else but behavior. But what about love? There's no love. There's no feeling of love. You just, loving a person means holding hands, kissing. In other words, behavior. It's all in the behavior. There's no mental a world. There's no mind or thoughts or anything. Okay? All your, what we call the mental states, beliefs, desires, hopes, are descriptions of behavior. When you say, I'm thinking about vacation, it's not that you're thinking of vacation. You are behaving in a way that signifies that you are going on vacation. That's all. You're behaving in such a way. It is bizarre, isn't it? I mean, the motivation is just to try to explain away the mental content. Is behaviorism true? It can be true because it can explain why, if you're thinking of something, that thought, for example, you're thinking of vacation, you can say, well, you can explain that as a behavior. Yes, but how do you explain the fact that a thought gives rise to a behavior? So your thinking of going on vacation leads your booking a vacation. Okay? This is an aspect that behaviorism is not able to capture. So from behaviorism, they came up with a different theory, the identity theory. Identity theory is just another way to explain what the mind is. And what identity theory says, you can get it from the name itself, is that the mental and the physical are identical. There's no separation, so to speak, or to speak of. Pain, for example, is identical to the firing of certain neurons. Thinking about vacation is nothing separate from the brain. Not a thought, but it's actually neurons firing in a certain way. Okay? So for every individual mental state that you can think of, that you can mention, there is an individual identical process in the brain that is happening. Well, I guess the problem with the identity theory is that, your thoughts are not really identical to your, think about it, to your mental, to your physical processes of the brain. Because think about what's happening in the brain. You're thinking about vacation, and you desire to go on vacation. Now your brain fires away. Your neurons fire away. The identity theorist says that what you call thought of going on vacation is merely the same thing as the process in your brain firing. But the problem is that when you're thinking of vacation, what are you thinking? I don't know you. Myself, right now that vacation is over, I'm thinking of a wonderful tropical beach with soft sand and blue ocean and palms. Beautiful, huh? That's what I'm thinking. How can you tell me, identity theorist, that the palms and the water and the sand are identical to my neurons firing? They're not identical. Now, the identity theorists may say, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that they are identical in that sense. What I'm saying is that, what are you saying? You're saying that the firing of certain neurons gives rise to my thinking of a blue sea and a sand and palms. That's exactly what we're talking about. Okay, you can explain the firing, but how do you explain the images, or in other words, the mental content of my thoughts? That can't be explained because my mental content, the content of my thoughts, is not identical to the chemicals fired by neurons. Can't be the same. So, a more clever theory was invented in order to at least to fix the problems with the identity theory. Now, to explain to you what functionalism is, let me give you an example. Let me give you an analogy. Let me use an analogy. The identity theory says, by the way, I didn't mention another problem with the identity theory. This is what, and I want to mention it because this is what what gave rise to functionalism. One of the biggest problems is the following. The identity theory says a certain firing of the brain explains a certain mental event. Okay? And the biggest problem is the following. If you don't have a brain made the same way that our brains, the human brains, is made, or a brain that doesn't really fire certain chemicals, then how do you explain the mind? So you can't reduce the mind to what our brains do. Okay? You can't reduce one to the other. So functionalism came along and said, the way of thinking about the mind is the same way of thinking about the function of a certain mechanism. All mechanisms have a function. So my light switch has a function. And the function is to switch the light off and on. A vending machine has the function of giving soda and water and chips. Similarly, the physical brain is not identical to the mind, but it has a function. And the function is the mind. Okay? So you don't need a brain like human brain in order to experience consciousness in a mental life. All you need is anything comparable that has that function. Functionalism, however, is also a very controversial theory, and I think that most neuroscientists today don't really buy into functionalism. Functionalism can't explain many things in can't totally explain away things like, for example, I mean, it explains some things, but it doesn't explain consciousness. The fact that we have a brain, okay, the brain has functions, so the mind is a function of the brain. You can have a brain, or you can have a different type of brain, Martian brain, and it has that function. The function would be the mental life, but it doesn't explain why it has a mental life in the first place. Why are we conscious? Could you, for example, I mean, it seems possible, logically speaking, to imagine an individual that has a brain, or something like a brain, a Martian brain, or whatever you want to call it, but it doesn't have consciousness. It's not conscious. So functionalism can't explain really what consciousness is. Also is not capable of explaining subjectivity, okay? Because functionalism says, well, the mental life is explained as a function of the brain, but different people might have different experiences, mental experiences that are private, okay? So that would be subjectivity. See, the problem of subjectivity can't be fully explained by functionalism. Another theory is the theory known as eliminative materialism. This essentially says there have been, think about all the scientific theories. They are not only old, they are obsolete, they are wrong, they're false. The phlogiston theory, for example, the caloric, there are many different theories. Okay, but also think about the theory that sick people are possessed by demons. We don't believe that anymore. We know that it's viruses and bacteria that cause illnesses. So we don't talk about those theories anymore. Eliminative materialism is the idea that psychology will eventually do away with the theory of the mind. Okay? Eliminate it in time. And explain the mind how? Well, explain the mind as something that happens, for example, that happens in different episodes. The mind is somehow, the brain somehow is responsible for the various episodes that happen to you. You are conscious, but your consciousness is not a uniform, smooth, continuous thing, for example. It's the brain that is bombarded by information and filters information. Some retain, some don't even register, some register very lightly. But it's all the brain. It's all the brain that gives rise to this. Yes, but how? We don't know. For that reason, before the end, for that reason, some people called the Mysterians think that we will never know. We will never know, because in order to understand consciousness, you would have to step away from consciousness. But we all immerse in consciousness. We all conscious, or at least we think we are. And so we can't really explain from within. We will have to explain from without, but that's an impossibility. So we will never know. Okay, so this is the end of this lecture. It's a brief lecture on the problem, the mind-body problem. There's much more that can be said, but this is what I want to say. And don't forget to post your comments, okay, and answer the questions. I'll see you in the next lecture. Have a good day.